This discussion today on race and identity in the Dominican Republic. This is a partnership with CARSU. I represent CARSU. I am the External Affairs Coordinator. My name is Abigail Ralph, and I'll be co-hosting this event. So please feel free to reach out and ask questions. And we're going to be starting very shortly once everyone just begins to roll in. First up, we have Professor Nestor Rodriguez. He teaches a course of Hispanic, Caribbean, and Latin American intellectual history and culture production. He is the author of Estrigas de Nocroche de la República Dominicana, translated into English as Divergent Dictations, Contemporary Dominican Literature, and 2 books of essays on cultural criticism. Critica pal tema do poco favor. Professor Rodriguez has written widely on Dominican, Cuban, and Puerto Rican culture production, particularly on issues on race and nationalism in literature, and the role of intellectuals in human Caribbean societies, and on Latin American poetry. His current research project is titled In Circular Landscapes, Hispanic Caribbean Poetry and Conflict Modernity. Next up, we're going to welcome Ramon Antonio Victoriano-Martinez, Assistant Professor of Spanish. Oh, we'll just wait for him to show up. Assistant Professor of Spanish at the Department of French, Hispanic and Italian Studies at the University of British Columbia. He was born in the Dominican Republic, where he studied law at the Universidad Católica Santo Domingo. He is a translator into Spanish of the struggle of the political democracy in Dominican Republic. He published The Global Foundations for Democracy and Development in 2008. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of Toronto in the area of Hispanic and Latin American literature in 2010. His current research project will analyze the current production of the so-called 12 Años de Balaguer, with emphasis in the representation of Blackness, literary experimentation, and political resonance. And we're going to welcome our last panelist. Here we have Mónica Espaillat Lizardo. We'll wait for her to show up. She's a direct MC PhD candidate at the Department of History and Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies. Her current dissertation project examines the construction of Dominican citizenship from the Trujillo dictatorship from 1930 to 1961 to 2012. The project investigates the formalization of the Dominican historical imaginary, the introduction of legal and institutional structures aimed at surveillance and citizen education, and the construction of a shared social identity via the use of protection of national patriotic symbols. By triangulating the discipline's traditional archives with oral histories and peripheral archives, she argues that the Dominican state undertook a eugenist nation-making projects that created, enforced, and enforces Dominicans of Haitian descent and trans-Dominicans as impossible citizens. So this has been remains and as a incomplete and contest to her project. So welcome everyone. And we're very, very happy and excited to be having this discussion with you. And I'm going to start by asking a few questions. So the first question is going to be for Professor Victoriano. This is a really big question. So in a couple of minutes, we're just going to break it down and further digest this question. So what do you see as being the key events and processes in the colonial history of Hispaniola, which have the most influence on race and identity?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you for having me. This is great, and greetings from the West Coast. Normally, people will go to the main big events, right? 1804. It will go for 1822, etc. For me, what I'm interested in now. It has to do with the period that I'm working on now. And it took me back to the 19th century. And for me, that period that goes between 1845 and 1866, immediately right after the separation, right? There's a whole campaign to get the United States to recognize Dominican Republic as an independent state. And starting in 1845, immediately, remember, Dominican Republic gets separated from Haiti in February 1844. So in January 1845, Jose Maria Caminero writes 2 lengthy letters to John C. Calhoun, Secretary of State, basically advocating for the recognition of Dominican Republic. And the arguments are that Dominican Republic will be a firewall against blackness, right? We have more time later to go into the nitty gritty, but basically Caminero argue, we are almost white, and the Negroes at the West should be kept at bay, right? And for me, that 20 years go from diplomacy to war. Haiti made 6 incursions until 1856. The final battle is in 1856. But there's a diplomacy going on with the United States. And the argument for Dominicans is, we don't want Black people to rule us anymore. And there are also 2 lengthy documents in the Whig Party review of 1849 that talks about Dominican Republic as an almost white. And the whole argument, again, the party of John C. Calhoun that will later become the Republicans, the argument again is, these people are almost white, but not quite. So to make a long story short, Haiti gets recognized first in 1862, right by Abraham Lincoln. And Dominican Republic doesn't get recognized by the United States until after the Civil War, until 1866. And when you go back to those 10 years between 1845 and 1855, for example, the Dominican Republic argument fails every time because the anti-slavery forces within the United States Senate play the Black card against Dominicans. So basically they say, these are Blacks that are trying to pass for whites. They shouldn't be in the union because you are the anti-Black people. So it's a very convoluted story that happens between these 3 countries in the first 20 years. So for me, right now, my interest is pointing toward that, right? So that's my main focus now, those early 20 years when the anti-Blackness sentiment start setting in Dominican Republic, which contradicts what a lot of people say about anti-Haitianism and anti-Blackness in Dominican Republic. That is a Trujillo construction and etc. So that's what I am now.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for your commentary. Now I'm just going to open up the floor to any other of the panelists if you have anything else to add to that question before we move on.
Yes, I think this is a moment to begin talking about the anti-Black sentiment in the Dominican Republic as something that starts from colonial times. Arturo is talking about the 19th century, but we need to go even farther back to understand where this begins as a discourse. It's part of what the Spanish Empire the Spanish Empire was trying to establish in the island, separating the Spanish side from the French that was gaining power and was becoming a prosperous colony, a more prosperous colony than the Spanish one. So that's when this reality of having 2 different cultures that will fight against each other in terms of the complexion of their inhabitants. And this is where all this begin. And one of the most important Dominican scholars, Silvio Torres Ayan, even has a theory about that, that the history of racism in the Western Hemisphere starts with the conquest. So that's taking this problem to the extreme. But I think Torres Ayan is right in the sense that this is what really happened in the Hispaniola, in the colonial times. We have a clear separation from the French and the Spanish side in terms of the racial component of their population. The Spanish side was describing itself as the bearers of the Christian piety, the whiteness, all this tradition that was becoming more and more important over the centuries in the Spanish side of the island. This is the origin of what later on became institutionalized in Dominican nationalist discourse. Is what Trujillo will do in the 20th century, and what Balaguer will perpetuate later on. So we need to even go back in history to talk about the origins of this problem that we're discussing today in the Dominican Republic and Haiti.
Yeah, thank you to both of you. I think the only thing that that I would want to add is just to really point to what you're saying and to really point to the importance. Arturo, you mentioned that, you know, a lot of people point, and Nestor as well, to the Trujillo dictatorship as being the moment that this comes alive. And I think that what's important about that is, like you're pointing to, that there is indeed a longer history there. But I think what's so important to highlight about the Trujillo dictatorship is just how successful that project of reimagining the nation has been, because it still is the way, I mean, that we imagine and think of the Dominican Republic, even when we're studying it from the present moment, and have, you know, the capacity to unearth a different sort of imagining. So this idea of Haiti and the Dominican Republic as being always fated enemies, always antagonistic to one another, what someone Martinez calls the sort of fatal conflict model of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, is something that I think the Trujillo dictatorship did successfully by really reimagining the history of the country. And so I think to me, it's just so profound how the use of intellectuals under the Trujillo dictatorship and historians, with Balaguer included, really was successful in pushing this narrative so far back into history that we're still living the repercussions of what some Dominican scholars have called this official lie, this idea that Dominican and Republic have always been and will always be fated to be enemies.
Yes, I think there's also that counter discourse, because I don't want to be Debbie Downer here, right? The one that says, like, you know, it's always so bad. There's also there's this counter discourse that starting in the say mid-60s start pushing back, right? That is a period that I'm working on now in my next project. You know, you can start, for me, it's, and now that Nestor mentioned Silvio, is actually one of Silvio's favorite authors, Franklin Franco, one of our favorite authors, right? And Franklin Franco has this vast production in the 60s from the Marxist perspective and analyzing all the class dynamics. But he has a book that he was recently translated into English, Black Mulattoes and the Nation, The Birth of the Nation, or something like that. I don't remember the translation now. Los Negros, los Mulatos y la Nación Dominicana. So Black Mulattoes and the Dominican Nation. And in that book, it's a whole construction. It's a whole argument, a full fleshed out argument against that nationalism that that Trujillo implanted. The problem for me, the problem is that as Mónica, as you really cleverly point out, is that Trujillo and its intellectuals were really good at converting this historiography into propaganda. They were really good. There are people still in the 21st century, in 2020, they tell you things that come right out of Jose Gabriel Garcia, right? It's like you know, history hasn't done anything in the last 150 years. So I think we could talk about that counter hegemony discourse that comes from below. Franklin Franco, Roberto Casá, I don't know, Hugo Tolentino Dib, Aida Cartagena Portalatin in the 80s with all the pro-Black writings that she did relating her travels in the 70s. So we have also that part, right? So I don't want to be the bad news messenger here.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for your conversation and for your insight. If no one else has anything to add, we're just going to move on to the next question. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question then, and this is going to start off with Professor Rodriguez. Do you think that the perceptions of the extent of anti-Blackness of the Dominican Republic are accurate or deserved? Oh, sorry, that's the third question. I'm just going to reread the question again. How much of the anti-Blackness and anti-Haitian sentiment is rooted in the long-standing elite attitude, and how does this correspond to the influence of state and the policies? The second part to that question is, what were some of the main ways that figures like Rafael Trujillo or Joan Balaguer institutionalized anti-Haitian sentiments?
I think part of that question has been addressed by Mónica before, so I'm going to add to some of the things that she has said. And for that, I think the best way to illustrate the examples of how this narrative has been ingrained in the mind of Dominicans, and we need to see some images. This is coming from my classes this semester. I'm going to share my screen so I can talk a little bit more about that. So when we talk about the whitening of Dominican culture, we need to think about those intellectuals that Mónica was mentioning before, particularly Balaguer. And Balaguer was let's say the most important figure for Trujillo to transmit this message of a white supremacy idea of Dominican culture. Balaguer wrote in 1947 a pamphlet for the regime, and where he had this strange theory about the Dominican nation coming directly from the connection between the Spanish heritage and the Taino native heritage. So this is one of the books that became regular reading for students in schools, in universities. It was a bestseller in the 1980s when it was re-edited. It went to about 20 re-editions. And one of the things that Balaguer said in that book is that the Dominicans are facing the constant threat of the Haitians at different levels, and not only biologically, but the most contentious one, morally. For me, this is basic propaganda for this particular narrative of the Dominican nation as descending from Europeans and the native Indian population. As you well know, there are no Taino natives in the island since the 16th century. The illnesses decimated that population. So it is recuperated as a historical component of this idea of Dominicanness. And this is what Balaguer explodes in this book that everybody have read in the island. And this is one of the ways that discourse produces what in my opinion is a collective delusion in the population. That way of doing such harm in the mind of the people as to negate what is obvious, the racial component of their complexion is not white, is not Taino, native Indian, is a African heritage. That's what you see in the Dominican Republic. And Balaguer went to extreme stance to try to obliterate that African component in talking about Dominican nationality. And this is an image from the book. This is a family that, according to Balaguer, is a quintessential of Dominicanness. As you can see, these are people with light complexion, and these are descendants of migrants from the Canary Islands. And this is for Balaguer what constitutes the epitome of the Dominican family. Imagine that if you're a kid, you're reading this in school, or if you're in university and you're reading this for a class, imagine having that kind of message constantly bombarded to you. You ended up having a kind of chip in your head telling you that this is the Dominican family. This is one of the ways that discourse has been perpetuated in Dominican society. This is a kind of symbolic violence that I see in even when I talk to my relatives in the Dominican Republic. And this is all coming from that kind of historical text. The island upside down is basically I would say the perfect example of how that kind of interpolation could cause harm in the development of people in the Dominican Republic. This is a picture that I always use when I try to describe these problematics in my courses. This is my first passport. And as you can see in the section of color, my color is Indio. That means I'm Taino native. And this is something that Dominicans will use to refer to their skin tone. And it's an euphemism to talk about blackness. You cannot say you're black, you need to say you are Indio. In my case, I will be an Indio Claro, like a light skin native Indian. That's a historical category that suddenly becomes a marker of the color of your skin. You cannot understand that until you see images like this, that is part of the everyday life of the Dominican. This is one of my favorite images when I talk about this in my courses. Sammy Sosa suddenly becomes another person. That this is Sammy today. This is Sammy when he started in the Major League Baseball. So this is another example of where this kind of discourse can take you in terms of the sanity of the people, mental sanity of the people in the Dominican Republic. And finally, the last image I use in my courses. This is a picture from a fashion magazine in one of the Dominican newspapers. So you can see this black model is using a coat that we use here in Canada, but imagine in the Dominican Republic, who will wear something like that? This is another example of where this kind of discourse takes us. It goes directly into how people assume themselves as subjects in the Dominican context. The other day, I was talking with someone about this image I have here. This is what I have in the cover of my book. It's by Dominican photographer Jose Uribe, and this image is representing a cachua. Cachua is a carnival that is celebrated in the southern part of the Dominican Republic, and is a celebration that has a long tradition in the island. Well, when I showed my book to a Dominican colleague, that colleague told me, why do you have a Haitian in the cover if we are talking about Dominican literature? That's the first impression that people get when they see the cover of my book. They cannot think about the Cachua as a Dominican. It's impossible because that is clearly a Haitian national in the cover of my book. This is part of all that education that I think is in the root of this problem of anti-Black sentiment in the Dominican Republic. So all those are examples of how this is transmitted. Even though you have, as Arturo mentioned before, a long tradition of academics working on the topic, this is a knowledge that is not getting out of the university halls, of the classrooms. This is something that stays there. And I think that is the main reason why this discourse is so hegemonic nowadays. There's a lot of work done in academia since the 1960s. Arturo mentioned the work of Franco. There are many studies, especially in the 1970s, that are talking about the African component of Dominican culture. But this is something that does not go to the street. It's not part of the everyday Dominican way of understanding their identity.
Thank you for that. I think with that slide, you really highlighted the effects and implications of the anti-Blackness perpetuation, especially with Sammy Sosa, and how it trickles down into the new generation. So now I'm just going to call on for any of the other professors if you'd like to add on.
I think thinking about Nestor, the picture of your passport is so fascinating to me. Part of my work is on the cédula, precisely because it is a piece of ID that functions from 1931 up until the present moment, up until 2014, to really mark race in the Dominican Republic, right? Like we can talk about like literal attempts to whiten the population in the Dominican Republic with Trujillo welcoming Jewish refugees into Sosúa, into the north of the country, while being an openly anti-Semitic man. But the idea that the Jewish population would help to literally whiten or lighten the complexion of Dominicans. So we have very literal examples, of course, the massacre in 1937 as well, like very literal bodily examples. Nestor, also what you're saying about education, the real sort of stringent policing of public education and public education curriculum in the Dominican Republic is something I was just reading about. I read a book called Unmastering the Script, which sort of traces this policing of the public education curriculum. And the ending sort of was a little bit optimistic in terms of perhaps some inconsistent but changing trends in terms of reimagining Blackness as a part of Dominicanidad, and contending also with Haitianness in the public school curriculum. But also even thinking about the sort of aesthetic techniques. Sammy Sosa obviously is like a really heartbreaking and extreme example, but even, the Dominican blowout, like that's famous. Who doesn't know about the Dominican blowout, right? Like that is such a cultural hallmark, I think, of Dominicanidad in so many ways. Like you see a salon in the Dominican Republic every few feet, but also the Dominican blowout is famous internationally, right? So we can also talk about these sort of aesthetic techniques of whitening, but the cédula in particular, in 1931, with the first iteration of the cédula, the color de piel goes on the cédula. And what's really interesting about this category, well, one of the really interesting things about this category is that you are not asked, at least for the, I'm not sure if this was true actually the entire history of the cédula up until the present, but at least my experience with the cédula and getting, you know, the iterations of the cédula that I got, you're not asked what you identify as, right? Like the person sitting in front of you decides what tipo de piel, type of skin, but really sort of racial assumption, they decide for you. And to me, it is so interesting because it really highlights the tensions about race being relational, right? So I have a piece of government ID that says that I'm India. And then I have a piece of ID that says that I'm Blanca, that I'm white. Just based on who was sitting in front of me that day, maybe the way I looked that day, so that there's really sort of this tension of race and its inconsistencies and its slipperiness that is highlighted by the cédula. And then a point that is really, really important about this document, the cédula, in 1931, with the first cédula granted to Trujillo, who was also Indio on his cédula as well, this category only gets dropped in 2014, which is the first time the Dominican Republic has a biometric cédula, mind you, that they paid companies in the United States of America to get, you know, to create for them. In 2014, it was voted the most secure document in the world by this company in the US that sort of rates different IDs and credit cards. And it's in 2014 that this category of skin or tipo de piel gets dropped. And that is exactly 1 year after the denationalization, the legal stripping of Dominican citizenship from generations of Dominicans. So, you know, this habit of pushing sort of new readings of Dominicanidad back into time, we see again with the sentencia in 2013, and then there is no longer a need. You know, I think you could argue that there's almost no longer a need in the sort of structural imaginary of the Dominican Republic to have tipo de piel because they've accomplished this denationalization, right? So 2014, that category is now dropped from the cédula, which I don't think is coincidental.
It's so funny because I have a cédula story, and I'm the older statesman here. So contrary to both of you, I did have cédula de papel. My cédula was a piece of paper typed in a typewriter and signed by hand by an officer, right? That's what we call cédula de papel. You guys have the plastic one, you young kids, and you know, with your technology and stuff, and pay the Americans to do your thing. So this is the story. I'm 16, I'm going to get my cédula. My mother, that bastion of care, sent me by myself to Oficialía de Estado Civil to get my cédula. I'm 16 years old, so I go there, and you know, they're starting to fill out the paperwork, and they put color of skin, Indio. And I said, what do you mean, Indio? And I was really insensitive at that time, like all 16-year-olds are. So I made a snarky comment about my image of Native Americans. I say, look, I'm not Indio. I'm Black. So you have to put negro in my cédula. And she looked at me astonished, like it's totally astonished. Because this is this raggedy ghetto kid, you know, with a small afro, telling her that I'm not Indio. And she said to me, okay, because I said, I'm not gonna sign that if you put Indio. And she said, okay, but you don't know the damage you are doing to yourself to put negro in mi cédula. I'm one of the very few Dominicans that had negro as color de piel. And then when in 20, I think it was in 96, 98, when we got the first plastic cedula, we still had the color de piel in. And my color de piel, because negro doesn't fit, it was N, right? Negro. And that was until 2014. They tried, they did an iteration, I think in 2011, and they brought mulatto, right? White, black, mulatto. Mulatto didn't take, so they scraped it in 2014. But I want to, since Nestor was sharing his images, I want to see if I can share an image here. And I play a trick on people. And I'm gonna share two images. This is the first one. Right? What nationality is that kid? Right? Nestor already answered, right? You know, it's a Haitian. It's a Haitian kid, right? Can I make it larger? Yes, I can. There you go. So as you can see, it's a crop. You can see that I'm playing a trick on people, right? It's a crop. So I play that. I have made that, I run social experiments on WhatsApp. So I've run this. And, you know, it's a Haitian kid. It's a Haitian, it's a Haitian, it's a Haitian. And then I say, okay. This is the original image. This is the front page of the largest magazine in Dominican Republic ever. This is Ahora in 1962. And this is a Miguel Angel Sainz photograph. It should be an iconic photograph. I love that photograph. And, you know, I'll try to see if I can find Sainz relatives and to get the original of that picture. This was a Niño Criollo in 1962. This is right after they killed Trujillo. This is right before Juan Bosch comes into power. There's a blackness that we are not ashamed of putting in public. We're gonna get it in the 70s. I grew up with all black characters, right? My dancers, my favorite merengue people are black people, right? My favorite players, they're black. They were all black. We were all black. In a government headed by an anti-black, anti-Haitian guy like Balaguer, right? So again, that tension here, right? So it's a very complicated, matter to talk about Dominican blackness, especially if we are looking at it from the North American perspective. One of the guys that I was reading, this was in the 90s. His name is, let me get this name so I just give proper credit. William Javier Nelson, I think it's Dominican. And he ends this amazing article on US diplomatic recognition on Dominican Republic with a tale of misrecognition. So basically John Hogan, who is remember when I talk about John Calhoun, right? So Calhoun in 1845 sends John Hogan to the United States, to Dominican Republic, to write a report about the feasibility of this island full of black people to govern themselves, right? So Hogan goes, and one of the things that Hogan concludes is that Dominicans are going to have a problem. If they want to keep their independence, they're going to have a problem because, and this is what Hogan said to Bobadilla, to Tomás Bobadilla, the main one of the main guys in the government in 1844, 1845. He says, the great percentage of colored people would weaken the Dominican Republic in its stance against Haiti. But Hogan is looking at it from the perspective of the United States, from the perspective of a slave society in which one drop rule rules supreme, right? Bobadilla doesn't understand it. Bobadilla doesn't understand how the American is looking at the Dominican. He doesn't get it. So he says that Bobadilla says, la nacionalidad dominicana tomará precedencia sobre la raza. Meaning, Dominicans will take nationality over race. And this is Tomás Bobadilla, a guy that has to go through all the fight with the blacks, the pardos and morenos, right? Blacks and mulattoes, to get them into the Republic. Dominican Republic have to accept the Haitian legislation against slavery in order to maintain a cohesive national project. Because the racial tension is there from the beginning. From the beginning, there's a racial tension. Black people and colored people are saying, okay, we get it, we speak Spanish, it's fine, but if you're going to enslave us again, we are not going to be any part of it. I just go to the East, right? So it is a very complicated matter, and it gets complicated as we move along. Now we don't have racial categories in the cédulas anymore, but that doesn't mean that the discourse is gone, right? We still talk about the India Canela as the object of desire, right? And you know, you will have people, well, look at the brouhaha that's happening now with Negrita from the Bronx, right? So we are not out there in any part of the Caribbean, not in Puerto Rico, not in Cuba, not in Dominican Republic.
That image that you shared was quite impressive, Arturo, and it strikes me that it comes from Ahora magazine that was controlled by very advanced minds in those years, especially people connected to the leftist ideas in the Dominican Republic. And it's one example of that counter discourse that you started developing before. There are many other instances of this kind of counter discourse, especially in literature. I have devoted my career to study that kind of archive. But it's a literature that takes precedence outside the Dominican Republic. I mean, you don't see authors like Aurora Arias, for example, being celebrated by Dominican critics. You barely see someone talking about Rita Indiana, for example, in the Dominican Republic. These are authors that are going directly against that Dominican anti-Haitian, anti-Black ethos. The literature is doing the work that the intelligentsia have not been able to do. Even though in North America, we are all very active publishing about these topics, we don't get to the Dominican everyday people. That's the main problem here for the constant presence of this narrative in Dominican society. And I think that's where we need to start as scholars, as literary critics and academics in general. This is where we need to start to dismantle that discourse. And if we are not able to intervene in that kind of discussion at the level of the everyday life in the Dominican Republic, nothing will change. And we're witnessing that constantly. I have tons of anecdotes of how this discourse is still very present in everyday life in the Dominican Republic. I remember, for example, just a few days ago, a Dominican journalist presented on his Twitter account a video of this guy that was having a fight with Dominican policemen. They were debating something about illegal selling of radio speakers. And well, the thing got really heated, and the person that thought that the police was somehow violating his rights, the only thing that this person could say to defend himself was to call the sergeant, the black Dominican sergeant that was after him, to call him maldito negro haitiano. That will be roughly translated as damn black Haitian. So we're witnessing someone that is as black as the policeman, telling the policeman that he is a damn black Haitian. So this is the kind of contrast that I see when we talk about this topic at the academic level and what you see just in everyday life. This is the contrast that I think should be the main point for us as intellectuals, as people that have some kind of voice and power to debate this kind of issue in the island. I think intervention at the public sphere is fundamental to be able to do something about this. Intervention in newspapers, op-ed pieces in newspapers, even if the intellectuals in the Dominican Republic will go after you and want to kill you. We need to start that kind of work to be able to make a dent in the pernicious discourse that is affecting Dominican society since time immemorial.
I'm going to keep my devil's advocate hat on the side for now, because I don't want to poke the nest yet, right? But I think you're right. I think we need that intervention, but we also need, and maybe I'm going to, because we have like 2 more questions. I can see the script and I don't want to take more time, but I think that we need the gadfly attitude, right? Is that you cannot dismay, you have to call them out, every single one of them. Doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter if they are your family. It doesn't matter if they are your friends. It doesn't matter who they are. Is that you cannot dismay. And here I'm talking about in general, not only as scholars, but as people, as political actors. You cannot dismay. You cannot give them that oxygen. You cannot give them that space. So every time it comes out, you need to get them down. Being in the social media, the WhatsApp group, because it's the preacher in me. You need to convert people, and you only do that by constantly preaching, right? It's the only way, because we are fighting against a machinery that has been going on for 150 years. It's very difficult to turn that tide, right? It's very difficult to move people. It's very difficult to make people pivot, right? So we need also that political action. And I agree with you, Nestor, 100%, is that we need that everyday intervention, right? It's to write that op-ed, to get that tweet out, to be in social media, to be in Instagram, etc. And there are a lot of young people out there doing an amazing work, right? In culture, reconocido, they are there, right? They are there. And you know, I'm a middle-aged man, so there are things that I cannot do. But from my perch, I can, you know, push against the tide with that. And unfortunately, and I don't know if this is the time of the space to talk about this, but unfortunately, the official culture in Dominican Republic doesn't help. When you give the National Prize of Literature to people that are unabashedly anti-Haitian, anti-Black, xenophobic, you are sending a message. That is a message. When you say that somebody like Roberto Marcalle, somebody like Manuel Núñez is deserving of the highest honor in academia, you are sending a message. You are saying what these people are saying is fine. What these people are selling is worth buying. And we have to push back. I hate to see my job as a counterpuncher, right? As a literary critic, but this is an arena, and you know, we have to counterpunch. Anyway, enough of the ranting of the old man.
Actually, if it's okay with you, Abigail, I thought I could answer the last question that you guys asked me to think about, because I actually think that this conversation leads really well into that.
Yeah, for sure. I was just actually about to ask you.
Okay, so
that question, so definitely go ahead. Do you want me to read it first, and then?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So that's question number 3.
Actually,
and just
question number 5. Sorry, just because I think it feeds really well into the conversation.
Oh, yeah, perfect. I'll just read the question right now.
Thank you, Abigail.
While there are clear many examples of intense and violent relationships between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, there are counterexamples in which solidarity, community building, and engagement can point potentially towards a different future.
Thank you so much, Abigail. So I definitely want to go back, obviously, to question 3 and 4. I have a lot to say actually about social media and the role of social media in both really creating a really strong counterculture, but also in like the memification of Dominican racial ideas, which is something that I've been thinking about lately. So I definitely want to go back to that. But I think the conversation, Nestor and Arturo, that you're offering about these countercultures or these counter examples is really important. And first, I just want to I want to just highlight this tradition of you know, the real sort of labeling and the real violent history here of actually persecution of intellectuals that are willing to think against these ideas of anti-Blackness, and to dismantle these ideas of anti-Blackness and anti-Haitianismo in the Dominican Republic, that they were persecuted by the Trujillo regime as enemigos de la patria, right? Enemies of the state. And that this tradition continues to this day, right? Like on WhatsApp, I got over the summer a meme, or somebody had basically recreated the poster for CUNY, which hosts the Dominican Studies department, that was, you know, really sort of foundational in the creation of Dominican studies as a field in North America. And I saw this. I have it. I don't even know if to share it, but they basically recreated the CUNY flyer and relabeled it Centro de Indoctrinización, like center of indoctrination, so that this rhetoric of continuing to be the enemy of the state, it's something that continues to this day, right? We see it during the Trujillo dictatorship, the literal disappearing of academics that are willing to think against and to fight, you know, the institutionalization of this anti-Blackness and of this anti-Haitianism, and we see it still continuing to this day. But to return, I think, to this question of counter examples, I actually just want to share some pictures that I took during one of my dissertation research trips to the Dominican Republic. And then I want to share just a couple reflections also from my research. So can you all see my screen? Yeah, okay. So the image that you're seeing is a picture that I took in Moca, which is sort of in the smack dab agricultural region of the Dominican Republic. It's the city that I'm from. And it's a city where there are a large population of Haitian immigrants and a lot of Dominicans of Haitian descent. Working in agriculture, in construction. And so this picture was taken in Ciudad Moca, like the downtown part of Moca. And on the wall is a graffiti that says, "Fuera los Haitianos," or out to the Haitians. So this picture was taken in Moca, and about a 20-minute drive outside of Moca. This one's a little bit blurry. I'm working on my film photography skills. But this was taken about a 20-minute drive from that first image that you saw. And what this says here is "Bienvenidos Haitianos." So, and you can kind of tell that there's a sort of tension happening on the back of this billboard, right? Like letters have been crossed out. There's a sort of graphing together to get this message across of "Bienvenidos Haitianos," or welcome Haitians. And so this for me serves as such a sort of poignant counterexample and a really poignant sort of counter imagining of the nation as what has become the official ideology or the official sort of rhetoric of imagining the Dominican Republic. So during my research trip, I had the opportunity to attend an event. This was in 2015. So it was 2 years after the denationalization. And I attended an event that was coordinated by the Universidad Dominicana, which is an LGBTQ organization in Santo Domingo. And so at this Universidad Dominicana event, Angie Rodriguez was speaking. So Angie is a openly trans woman who has now been officially elected to government in Navarrete, which is a part of Santiago, or outside of Santiago. And so Angie was speaking about her experience as a trans woman in the Dominican Republic, in Dominican government. And during this conversation, a woman in the audience stands up and she says, she's a teacher from just right on the outskirts of Santo Domingo, and she has brought her students, her high school students, to this talk. Many of them were affected by the denationalization. And so she's brought her students to this talk to continue learning because she understands that their experiences of denationalization are somehow linked to the marginalization of LGBTQ persons in the Dominican Republic. And so this really sort of poignant conversation took place between these high school students that had been affected by the denationalization and Angie. And there was questions about cédula and identity and et cetera. But that also really served as a moment for me where I think there's so much evidence of the ways in which Dominicans organize outside of what is sanctioned by the state and build communities of political care, of support outside of what is sanctioned by the state. And that is what has allowed so many people to continue surviving against such tremendous violence. The last sort of part of this vignette is that Rosana Marzan, who is the founder and the current director of the Universidad Dominicana, this LGBTQ organization in Santo Domingo. So she actually, so I was lucky enough to interview Rosana for my dissertation. And one of the things that Rosana shared with me is that her entry into activism was actually because of Sonia Pierre. And Sonia Pierre is the, this spectacular Dominican woman who has been demonized in really sort of right-wing circles in the Dominican Republic for the tremendous work that Sonia did to protect the rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent. And so you see this, this link, right? So Rosanna shared with me about her experience. Her first time in activism was organizing with Sonia, and how it was actually Sonia Pierre, before she passed, who encouraged Rosanna to really persevere in her activism for the LGBTQ community in the Dominican Republic. And so these threads, I think, really highlight for me this counter narrative that does and always exists, and that the state has never succeeded in eradicating. And so those are just some of the things I'm obviously thinking about a lot, because I'm hopefully, yes, definitely writing my dissertation, but just really, I think, serve as poignant examples to this conversation that we were having.
Monica, thank you for sharing that with us. I think your work will really make an impact in the field of Dominican studies, and I'm really hoping to see that published pretty soon. I want to go back to something you mentioned at the beginning of the of your comment, and it has to do with the power of the elites that control especially the media in the Dominican Republic and the economic structures of the island. And I think this is something that we haven't discussed, the impact of the development of capitalism in the Dominican Republic. And we have talked about the connection between anti-Blackness and anti-Haitianismo. But this is something that comes from a very specific historical particularity of the island, and it has to do with the American invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1916. And it is there, and at that particular moment when the Haitians started to come to the Dominican Republic to work in the sugarcane industry. This is something that usually gets put aside when we talk about anti-Blackness and anti-Haitianismo in the Dominican context, but it's basically the base of that discourse that is still so prevalent today. There is a whole archive of supporters of the dominant discourse on Dominican identity. Arturo mentioned Manuel Núñez and the infamous Marcayet. We have many more. These are Black writers, Black intellectuals that are negrophobic, which is for me totally dramatic when we think about that carefully. But rarely we talk about these families that are behind the scenes doing the work of producing more profits, the families that have developed capitalism in the Dominican Republic, and the families that sustain the country economically. A few years ago, about 10 years ago, there was a showing at the University of Toronto of documentary on sugarcane cutters in the Dominican Republic. It's a documentary from 2007, The Price of Sugar. That was shown at the university, and I was baffled to see that one of these moguls from the Dominican Republic hired a New York-based lawyer, Buffett, to try to hold the university accountable for having shown that documentary. This is an example of how powerful this discourse is and how connected it is to the economic interests of moguls in the island that are taking by the hand the Dominican officials in how to perpetuate this idea of Dominican identity. This is something that we also need to discuss. These documents that I'm talking about are of public domain, and at the university we could see the letter that was sent by these lawyers from New York to try to make the university back down on this issue. And this is something that we need to talk about to be able to really go to the root of the problem, to be able to go against everything that has been said so far, and just attack the people that really are doing harm in the Dominican Republic. I have a column since 2011 in a newspaper in the Dominican Republic, and I once tried to talk about the sugarcane industry in the island and how this particular family is behind all the issues of human rights violations in Dominican batallas. I tried to publish that piece, and the newspaper said, we can't, we're not going to publish it. We're talking about the newspaper where I have published for years. They were so afraid of mentioning that issue in their publication because of the potential retaliation of this family that they just told me, you can't. I had to publish that in an online magazine from Venezuela because there was not one Dominican blog or newspaper or magazine that would be able to publish that without thinking of a potential retaliation. So this is another example of how extreme this topic is and how difficult it is to talk about it and to make some kind of difference in the way Dominican blackness is discussed nowadays.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your commentary as well. And I think this discussion does a lot to break the discourse of everything that you guys have been talking about. And it's great for us to have discussions like this. Now I'm just going to move on to questions from the audience and combine that with questions that we already have planned. So this one is directed to Professor Victoriano. And someone from the live chat has said, in class we learned that despite the Dominican Republic wanting to get independence from Haiti, it wasn't so straightforward. But in the end, Haiti helped the Dominicans fight the Spanish. I think that is still powerful, but it seems erased. Can anyone speak to this? And that's in combination with the question number 4, which goes to state, there was an amendment with which an estimate 200,000 to 300,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent were stripped of their citizenship. So would anyone like to speak to this question? And I'm going to open the floor to you guys.
It's my turn. It's me, right? Okay. Well, the first thing to go with what Nestor said, the Vicini's had a lot of power. They have an incredible amount of power, and Christopher Hartlyn, right? The price of sugar and all that, and they have been steadfast in getting that. But at the same time, their minions and their proxies are on the crosshairs of the so-called nationalists because of the fusion, right? Because the economic interest of the elite doesn't care about the border. I always tell my paranoid nationalistic friends and family that they worry about me as an agent of the fusion. I always say the fusion already happened and is run by 18 families, right? That have businesses that are across the border. So I think we have to put also that into perspective. Just today, former President Hipólito Mejía said, we need to open our doors to the Haitians. That was today. And he was immediately attacked on Twitter by the rabid nationalists saying that the plan in Quebec with George Bush didn't work and Hope Law didn't work. That approach is going to be is going to destroy Dominican Republic. So even among the elites, when the economic power dictates that they have to cross borders and they have to, erase that raya, they do so, right? So that's one thing. The thing with the sugar is also the combination of the Vicinis and the Fanjuls and all that power, the Republican and Democratic power in Florida, right? So there's also that a transnational net of power, right? To answer the first question regarding the 1861, 1865 fight, there's a very good book by one of our colleagues, Ann Eller. It's called We Dream Together, that takes head on that particular case, and it's absolutely true. And one of the things that me as a middle-aged Dominican, that it's always fascinating is how we forget that we learned in Dominican history classes in 5th grade, 6th grade, that Francisco del Rosario Sanchez, who's one of the fathers of the land, fathers of the fatherland, has to enter through Haiti to fight against the annexation. And it's a very moving speech in which he say, I entered through Haiti because I cannot do it from anywhere else, but never forget that I am the Dominican flag, right? And he gets, executed by other people, the annexionists. So Haiti is fundamental in getting Dominican independence. The one that for Pedro Enrique Sureña was the actual independence. Pedro Enrique Sureña wrote that the actually he thinks that the actual independence was the fight against Spain, right? And regarding the decision in 2013, it's been a long fight and it hasn't ended, right? So to recapitulate, in September 2013, the Constitutional Tribunal decided a matter regarding the nationality of a Dominican woman of Haitian parentage, Juliana de Qui-Pierre, and the Constitutional Tribunal decided that she is not Dominican because her parents were undocumented residents at the moment. Like, she was born in Dominican Republic in 1984 under a constitution that guaranteed the nationality of all persons born in the land, except for those in transit or those of the spring of diplomatic personnel. So the Dominican jurisprudence consistently since 2005, this didn't start in 2013. Since 2005, Dominican jurisprudence has been consistent in saying that the children of undocumented people are not Dominicans because those undocumented people are considered on transit, right? It happened in 2005 with the Jean Bosico decision. It happened in 2007 with the administrative order of the Junta Central Electoral, and then it was finalized in 2013. In 2013, that decision is the final word, right? There's no appeal. There's no way to overturn that. That provoked a furious backlash, both inside and outside, international pressure, and the government relented immediately, basically. So there's a decree 32713 that creates a national regularization plan, right, for foreigners. So it's the national plan of regularization of foreigners in irregular migratory situation. So you bring how long is the title, right? Then the next year, they enshrine that into law. So basically, the law 16914 is to register all those born in Dominican Republic of foreigners, non-resident foreigner parents between June 16, 1929 and April 18, 2007 that are registered in the civil registry. So that's one group. That's what we call group A. And then the other one, the group B, is those born of irregular migrant parents that are not registered. So we are talking about, at that moment, we were talking about 300,000 foreign people. This is an immense amount of people here. And those are 250,000 are just Haitians, right? People don't talk about that, how that decision and those laws affect also potentially Japanese migrants that came during the Trujillo era after 1929. Lebanese migrants, right, that came between 1929 and 2007. But those people don't have a problem, right? Haitians do, right? And people of Haitian descent do. So there's obviously here a racial bias. So all these efforts are now basically in place. And the last time I checked, the regularization pace is really, really slow, right? And I think the last decree signed by Presidente Medina right before he left, it was 750,000 people that were naturalized. That's decree 26220. It's one of the last decrees by Presidente Medina. I think it was August 14, 2 days before he left the government, or 3 days before he left the government, something like that. And it was only 750 people, right? So we don't know right now how many thousands of people are in this limbo, because they are in a limbo, right? People have lost the scholarships, people have lost years of education. Kids don't have papers to go to a school, so the Ministry of Education have to issue an order, and it's a sort of executive order to get those kids in 6th grade to be accepted, right? And I think that now I'm somewhat optimistic, right? I'm somewhat optimistic. In the new government, picking Roberto Alvarez as foreign minister and Rubén Silie Valdés as ambassador in charge of inter-Caribbean affairs or something like that. But two allies of this cause. Let's see if they can, deliver.
Thank you so much, Arturo. The only thing I would add to that is, for folks that are interested, there's a really good documentary called Hasta la Raíz, Down to the Root. And it's actually available on YouTube, full length, with English subtitles for folks that are interested as well. And I think that documentary also does a really good job of sort of tracing the historical trajectory of that ruling, which, like Arturo, you point out, like this is a slow building, sort of longer historical project. when we put it back into that historical timeline, it doesn't seem so shocking. It seems like you really clearly see the progression of that intent.
Arturo, it's interesting that you mentioned the Japanese community in the Dominican Republic, the Lebanese community. These are very important groups in Dominican history. But the issue is that what the sentencia does is only affecting the Haitian immigrants. It's something that is addressed specifically towards them. And I don't see, for example, a problem with the German or Spanish tourists that decided to stay in the Dominican Republic. They don't even have to go to the public offices to get a cedula. They just buy a house, they buy a business, and they stay. This is a contrast that we need to be also talking about, because what the sentencia does is simply to perpetuate patterns that we have been talking about in this webinar about things that are from the 19th century, since the beginning of the Dominican Republic as a state.
Okay, so I just wanted to jump in if it's possible, because I'm conscious of the time. If people can hear me? Okay, great. So I've just been hanging back in the fold, listening to everything that's been happening for the last hour and a half, and this has been incredible. I think that we need to have these conversations more often, because something that we were talking about even before the call went live was about these kinds of disconnects that happen between linguistic and cultural spaces within the Caribbean, and how we tend to, and I know there's a lot of people that break out of it, so I'm not saying this is for everyone, but often growing up, if you're a St. Lucian, Jamaican, Trinidadian, Dominican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, like we tend to, because of those reasons, we tend to stay with each other. But I think that there's a lot of things that come up, and I think Arturo mentioned very quickly the point of Cardi B, the comrade from the Bronx that's there earlier. But I think those interjections into culture, when talking about race and what it means in a space like the Caribbean or the Dominican, because they're not monolithic in that sense, how we can learn a lot more about how these ideas and these attitudes and behaviors and also the politics kind of emerge. So I think this was really enlightening for a lot of us, because I know the motivation that came for us to have this event this afternoon or this evening was from students in Caribbean studies, saying that we want to have a chance to be able to ask questions, because very often we're talking about race in the context of the English-speaking Caribbean, which is relatively different from what we see in the Dominican because of the history and all of the reasons that have been laid out. So I think this has been fascinating. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And I wanted to thank Abigail from CARSU for asking these questions, and also David as well, and all of the CARSU exec for collaborating to put on this event. It's going to be the first of many that we have planned for, this is the last one for this year, but we have several coming up for the next year. And it was great. And I'm really glad to see so many important Dominican scholars affiliated with or connected to the University of Toronto Caribbean Studies program on a single call tonight. That was the embarrassment of riches. And I learned a lot. I've been taking notes, and I know my students as well that have been watching as well, that is something that we're going to be talking about next week when we join up. So I just wanted to thank you all for your contributions tonight, and I hope that we can do it again because it was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. Stay hi to everybody there.
Definitely. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
You too. Bye-bye. Take care. Thank you.